Hi, it's Christina with the Sisyphean Journal. Today is July 28th. I already covered today's two anniversaries. They were young black women who died exactly 1 year apart. Black women are more pro-life than white women, but somehow they wind up on the abortion table at least twice as frequently, and once they're on the abortion table, they are at least twice as likely to end up dead. Wonder why nobody in the Black Lives Matter movement seems to care about their black lives. So because I've already covered those deaths, I'm going to link to them below. And because I want to give you new material, I'm going to go back to the Kermit Gosnell grand jury report, which I will link to below. In a previous post, I covered the beginning of the kind of introductory section that the grand jury wrote, covering just the general yuckiness of his clinic, and then covering what he did to the babies. Now we're moving on to the next section, which the grand jury summarized as butcher of women. Gosnell didn't just kill babies. And when they say kill babies, they mean kill babies. Born, viable, if you took them to the hospital, they would have a great chance of survival. Babies. He would deliver them alive and then take a surgical scissors right here at the back of the neck and sever their spinal cords to kill them. So Gosnell didn't just kill babies. He was also a deadly threat to mothers. Not every abortion could be completed by inducing labor and delivery. On these occasions, Gosnell would attempt to remove the fetus himself. The consequences were often calamitous, though that didn't stop the doctor from trying to cover them up. One woman, for example, was left lying in place for hours after Gosnell tore her cervix and colon while trying unsuccessfully to extract the fetus. Relatives who came to pick her up were refused entry into the building. They had to threaten to call the police. Eventually, they found her inside, bleeding and incoherent, and transported her to the hospital, where doctors had to remove almost half a foot of her intestines. On another occasion, Gosnell simply sent a patient home after keeping her mother waiting for hours without telling either of them that she still had fetal parts inside her. And that's not an uncommon thing. In fact, there was a case, it was Dr. Braxton Tabb in Colorado. He was reported to the medical board for sending a patient home with the fetal head still inside her, which has the possibility of causing both fatal bleeding and fatal infection, or a combination of bleeding and infection. So the medical board had disciplined Dr. Tabb, but he challenged it and got other Colorado abortion doctors to come forward and say, we send patients home with fetal heads in them. And because they were using what's called a community standard of care, sorry about my dog there. Because they used what was called a community standard of care, whatever other abortionists did was good enough, and that included sending patients home with the fetal head still inside them, sending them home with a potentially fatal situation. So Gosnell insisted she was fine even after signs of serious infection set in over the next several days. By the time her mother got her to the emergency room, she was unconscious and near death. A 19-year-old girl was held for several hours after Gosnell punctured her uterus. As a result of the delay, she fell into shock from blood loss and had to undergo a hysterectomy. But abortion doesn't ever affect your ability to have babies later. You can always have another baby later. One patient went into convulsions during an abortion, fell off the procedure table, and hit her head on the floor. Gosnell wouldn't call an ambulance and wouldn't let the woman's companion leave the building so he could call an ambulance. Undoubtedly, there were many similar incidents, but even they do not demonstrate Gosnell at his most dangerous. Day in and day out, the greatest risks came when the doctor wasn't even there. Gosnell set up his practice to rely entirely on the untrained actions of his unqualified employees. They administered drugs to induce labor, often causing rapid and painful dilation and contractions. But Gosnell did not like it when women screamed or moaned in his clinic, so staff were instructed to sedate them into stupor. Of course, his assistants had no idea how to manage the powerful narcotics they were using. Gosnell prepared a list of preset dosage levels to be administered in his absence. Actually, it was a teenage girl, a 15-year-old high school student, who drew up the anesthesia chart, and that's visible in the thumbnail to this video, but it's also included in the grand jury report that I linked to below. But no allowances were made for individual patient variations or for any monitoring of vital signs. All that mattered was the money. The more you paid, the more pain relief you received. It was all completely illegal and completely unsafe. Only in one class of cases did Gosnell exercise any real care with these dangerous sedatives. On those rare occasions when the patient was a white woman from the suburbs, Gosnell insisted that he be consulted at every step. When an employee asked him why, he said it was the way of the world. Karnamaya Mangar was not one of those privileged patients, and I'll link to her story below. She was a 41-year-old refugee who had recently come to the United States from a resettlement camp in Nepal. This poor woman had spent 20 years in this refugee camp. When she arrived at the clinic, Gosnell, as usual, was not there. Office workers had her sign various forms that she could not read. She was not an English speaker. Then began doping her up. She received repeated, unmonitored, unrecorded intravenous injections of Demerol, a sedative seldom used in recent years because of its dangers. Gosnell liked it because it was cheap. And Demerol was good for lots of kinds of pain, but it wasn't real great for labor pain. Every woman of my generation I know who had Demerol when they were in labor said it stank. All it did was make us, we were in just as much pain, but we were too incoherent to effectively report the pain. And sometimes we hallucinated. Both I was talking to people who weren't there, and my friend's wife was talking to people who weren't there. So all this Demerol's doing, it's not alleviating the pain, it's just making the women dopey and incoherent. After several hours, Mrs. Mangar stopped breathing. When employees finally noticed, Gosnell was called in and briefly attempted to give CPR. He couldn't use a defibrillator, it was broken. Nor did he administer emergency medications that might have restarted her heart. After further crucial delay, paramedics finally arrived, but Mrs. Mangar was probably brain dead before they were even called. In the meantime, the clinic staff hooked up machinery and rearranged the body to make it look like they had been in the middle of a routine safe abortion procedure. Even then, there might have been some slim hope of reviving Mrs. Mangar. The paramedics were able to generate a weak pulse, but because of the cluttered hallways and the padlocked emergency door, it took them over 20 minutes just to find a way to get her out of the building. Doctors at the hospital managed to keep her heart beating, but they never knew what they were trying to treat because Gosnell and his staff lied about how much anesthesia they had given and who had given it. By that point, there was no way to restore any neurological activity. Life support was removed the next day. Karnamaya Mangar was pronounced dead. Then they move on. I'm going to end this here. We're 8 minutes. I'm also going to provide a link to the other dead patient we know about, Shamika Shaw. And this is a young black woman. She wasn't one of those white women that you provide better care for because that's the way of the world.